Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift slowly toward one of the strangest agreements human beings have ever made: the quiet decision that a single, soft, gleaming metal should stand for the value of almost everything else. We will not study its chemistry tonight, nor chase it through rivers and mines. Though both will pass gently through our story, we will simply follow how gold came to mean wealth itself. Beneath some of the great cities of the world, behind walls of concrete and steel, there are rooms filled with gold. The bars rest on shelves, stacked and counted, gleaming faintly under careful light. They do nothing at all. They turn no engines and feed no one. They send no messages and warm no hands. And yet the value held in those silent rooms can steady currencies, reassure nations, and shape the confidence of people who never see a bar. It is a strange thing to consider as the day winds down. Somewhere in the dark, a fortune sits motionless behind a vault door, and its worth flows out into the world without the metal ever moving. We have agreed across the planet that this substance means something. If these calm journeys help you rest, you can follow SleepWise and share it with someone who might enjoy falling asleep while learning something new. There is no need to remember any of it. Let the facts arrive softly and drift past, like coins slipping through open fingers. Consider how unlikely the whole arrangement is. Gold cannot be eaten, and it cannot shelter you from cold. It is too soft to make a good blade, and too heavy to carry in great quantity. By the plain measure of survival, it is nearly useless. A handful of seeds or a vessel of clean water would serve a hungry traveler far better than a pocket of gold. For most of history, it built no tools and turned no wheels that mattered to daily life. And yet, for thousands of years, across cultures that never met and languages that never mingled, human beings reached for this same yellow metal and called it precious. Peoples separated by oceans and centuries arrived at the same quiet conclusion. There was something about gold that the eye kept choosing. That shared instinct is the real mystery. It is easy to assume that gold is valuable because it simply is, as though worth were baked into the metal like its weight or its shine. But value is not a thing you can hold. It is something we extend toward an object together, a kind of quiet collective trust. Gold did not arrive in the world wearing a price. We place that price upon it slowly, over the long course of history, and built much of our civilization on top of that choice. So before the coins and the kingdoms, before the vaults and the standards, one soft question waits beneath everything else. Of all the things in the earth, all the stones and gleaming ores, why did we choose this one to carry the weight of value? To understand the choice, it helps to imagine the field of competitors. The earth offers many metals and many minerals, and early peoples knew a fair number of them. Copper, silver, iron, lead, tin, and others all had their uses, their textures, their gleam. So gold was not the only candidate for the role of money. It had to win that role quietly, against everything else the ground could offer. And when you lay out what money actually needs to do, the reasons gold kept winning begin to come into focus. Money must last. A store of value that rots or rusts is no store at all. And here, gold is almost magical in its stubbornness. It does not corrode, it does not tarnish, and it does not react with the air the way iron flakes into rust or silver darkens with time. A gold coin pulled from an ancient shipwreck after centuries beneath the sea can emerge as bright as the day it was struck. This refusal to decay gave gold a quality that felt almost beyond the ordinary world. It seemed incorruptible, untouched by the slow ruin that claims nearly everything else. Money must also be scarce, but not impossibly so. If a substance is too common, there is too much of it to hold meaning, and if it is too rare, there is not enough to share around. Gold sits in a strange and fortunate middle. There is little enough of it that a small amount carries great worth, yet enough exists to be gathered, traded, and passed from hand to hand. All the gold ever mined in human history, it is often said, would fit within a surprisingly modest cube. That scarcity is real, and it is part of why a little gold has always meant a lot. There is a deeper reason for that rarity hidden in the metal itself. Gold does not form easily, and the earth holds only so much of it within reach. No king could command more into being, and no craftsman could conjure it from cheaper stuff. Then there is divisibility. A cow has value, but you cannot pay half a cow and keep the other half alive. Gold can be melted, split, and weighed into pieces, large or small, without losing anything of itself. A single bar can become 100 coins, and those coins can be measured against one another with care. The metal bends to the size of the bargain, whether grand or humble. Few valuable things share that easy, endless dividing. Finally, gold is unmistakable. Its warm yellow color belongs to almost no other metal, and its remarkable heaviness is hard to fake. A merchant could weigh a coin in the palm, watch the light move across it, and feel a quiet confidence that it was real. These qualities together, durability, scarcity, divisibility, and recognition, made gold extraordinarily well suited to carry value across time and distance. It was as though the metal had been quietly designed for the task. But long before anyone stamped it into coins, gold served another role entirely, one closer to the temple than the marketplace. Long before gold was money, it was meaning. In the earliest civilizations, the metal belonged less to merchants than to gods and kings. It adorned temples, wrapped the bodies of the dead, and crowned the heads of those who ruled. The people of ancient Egypt loved gold with a particular devotion. They called it the flesh of the gods, the very substance of the divine, and they believed it shone with a light that did not fade. To them, its eternal brightness mirrored the eternal life they hoped to reach beyond death. When a pharaoh was laid to rest, gold went with him into the dark. The famous burial mask of the young king Tutankhamun, recovered long after his time, was worked from gold so pure it still gleams across the centuries. It was not made to be spent. It was made to last forever, a bridge between a mortal body and an undying world. In this earliest chapter, then, gold was sacred before it was financial. Its worth came not from trade, but from wonder, from the way it seemed to hold sunlight inside a solid form. To possess it was to possess a piece of the heavens, a token of power that ordinary metals could never grant. Yet, even in those early days, gold was beginning its slow drift toward money. Kings gathered it as treasure, and treasure could be given as reward, offered as tribute, or used to settle the obligations of rulers. A metal that everyone desired could, quite naturally, become a way of paying. But there was a problem, and it was a practical one. In those days, before coins existed, gold passed by weight. A lump of the metal had to be measured on a scale each time it changed hands, and its purity had to be trusted or tested. This made every transaction slow and uncertain. How much gold was truly here, and was it mixed with cheaper metal to fool the eye? A merchant receiving a rough nugget could not simply glance at it and know its worth. Scales appeared in marketplaces and temples alike, small balances that weighed metal against standard stones. Trade became a careful ritual of weighing and judging, of trust extended and trust withheld. Value existed, but it had to be confirmed grain by grain on every single occasion. The danger was always the same. A dishonest trader might blend gold with a paler, cheaper metal, hoping the mixture would pass for the pure thing. The careful merchant learned to test as well as weigh, scratching it against a dark stone to read its color. Imagine the patience this demanded. Each payment was a small negotiation over weight and quality, a pause in which two people had to agree on what the metal before them was truly worth. It worked, but it was clumsy, and it left wide room for doubt and for cheating. What the world needed was a way to fix the answer in advance, so that a piece of gold could carry its own guarantee. Somewhere in a small kingdom in the ancient world, that idea was about to take a remarkable form. The kingdom was called Lydia, and it lay in what is now the western part of Turkey. It was a land blessed with gold, for a river ran through it, carrying flecks of the metal down from the hills. From those waters, and from the earth around them, the Lydians gathered a natural blend of gold and silver that the ancient world called electrum. In Lydia, more than 2,500 years ago, someone had a quiet idea that would change everything. Rather than weighing lumps of metal at every exchange, why not shape the metal into small standard pieces, each of a known weight, and mark each one with a stamp to vouch for it? That stamp was a promise pressed into the metal itself. These were among the first true coins. Each bore an image, often a lion's head, the emblem of the Lydian kings. The image said, in effect, that the ruler stood behind this piece, that its weight and content could be trusted without weighing it again. The change this brought was profound, though it may seem small at first. Suddenly, money no longer had to be measured on a scale at every step. A coin could simply be counted, passed and accepted because the hard work of judging its value had already been done and sealed by authority. Trade grew lighter and faster. A traveler could carry a purse of coins and spend them in a market without halting to weigh and test each payment. The coin carried its own credibility stamped into its face, and that credibility traveled with it wherever it went. The most famous of the Lydian kings was Croesus, a name that became a byword for wealth. To this day, in some languages, to be rich as Croesus is to be rich almost beyond measure. Under his reign, the kingdom refined its coinage, separating gold from silver to mint coins of purer, more reliable metal. Croesus could not have known what he had helped set in motion. The idea of stamped, standardized money was so useful that it spread outward like a ripple, carried by traders and travelers into the lands beyond. Other kingdoms saw the convenience and began to strike coins of their own. What made the idea so powerful was the trust it carried. A coin did not ask you to believe in the metal alone, but in the authority whose mark it bore. In one small disk, the word of a king and the worth of the metal were bound as one. There is something almost humble about the origin of so vast an invention. It did not begin with a grand philosophy of money. It began with a practical wish to make trade easier, to spare merchants the endless labor of the scale. Yet, from that modest wish grew one of the most powerful tools humanity has ever devised. The coin would outlast the kingdom that made it, outlast Croesus and his lions, and become the shape that money wore for thousands of years to come. And as it spread, gold passed from the temples of kings into the hands of ordinary people, ready to become the metal of empires. From Lydia, the idea of coined money flowed outward into the Greek world. The cities of ancient Greece, restless and trading, took to coinage with enthusiasm. Each city struck its own coins, marked with its own symbols, its gods and creatures and emblems of civic pride. Athens placed an owl upon its silver, the bird of the goddess Athena, and that owl flew across the seas in the purses of merchants. Coins became small ambassadors, carrying the image and reputation of their home city far beyond its walls. To accept a coin was to trust the place that made it. Through these coins, money became something more than convenience. It became a language, a shared medium through which strangers from distant cities could trade without ever speaking the same tongue. A piece of stamped metal could be understood by anyone, in any market, as a token of agreed worth. Then came Rome, and with Rome the scale of money grew vast. As the empire spread across 3 continents, it carried its coinage everywhere, binding distant provinces into a single web of trade. A coin minted in the heart of the empire could buy bread at its farthest frontier. Roman money came in many metals, but gold held the highest place. The gold coin, known as the aureus, was the currency of large sums and serious wealth, the metal of soldiers' pay, grand purchases, and imperial treasuries. To hold gold was to hold a portion of the empire's confidence in itself. Money in this age was not only practical, it was a message. The faces of emperors gazed out from the coins, spreading their likeness to people who would never see them in the flesh, declaring across the whole empire who ruled and who deserved loyalty. In this way, a coin was both wealth and propaganda, value and voice at once. An emperor could announce a victory, a new ruler, or a claim to power simply by striking it into metal and letting it travel. The smallest coin became a herald carried in a stranger's pocket. For a long while, this system held with remarkable steadiness. The flow of gold and silver through the empire's veins kept trade alive across an enormous span of the ancient world. Roads carried goods, and coins carried the trust that made the goods worth moving. Beneath the surface, though, a quiet weakness was waiting. The empire's appetite for spending was vast, on armies, on monuments, on the endless costs of holding so much territory together. And there is always a temptation for those who make money when the treasury runs low and the bills keep coming. It is a temptation as old as coinage itself, and the Romans would not be the last to feel it. The gold and silver could be stretched quietly in a way few would notice at first. What happened when they gave in to that temptation is a story the whole future of money would learn from. The temptation had a simple shape. A ruler who needed to pay soldiers, build monuments, or fund a war could not easily conjure more gold from the ground. But there was another way to stretch the treasury, quieter and far less honest, and Rome discovered it slowly over many years. The trick lay in the coins themselves. A silver coin did not have to be pure silver. If a mint mixed in a little cheaper metal, copper or lead, it could make more coins from the same amount of precious metal, each one looking much like before. The Roman silver coin, known as the denarius, began its life rich in silver. But across the generations, emperor after emperor reduced the silver within it, blending in baser metals while keeping the outward appearance the same. To the eye, the coin still gleamed. Inside, it was quietly becoming something less. This is the practice we call debasement, and it's one of the oldest tricks in the long history of money. For a while, it can feel almost like magic. The ruler gains more coins to spend, and at first, no one seems to lose, because the coins still pass from hand to hand as before. But the magic never lasts. People are not so easily fooled forever, and merchants in particular have sharp eyes for the metal they are paid in. As the coins grew thinner in true worth, those who traded began to notice, and they responded in the only sensible way. They raised their prices. If a coin held less real silver than it once had, then more coins were needed to buy the same loaf of bread, the same measure of grain, the same length of cloth. The numbers on the price tag climbed, not because goods had grown rarer, but because the money itself had grown weaker and thinner in its worth. This is inflation, though the Romans had no such word for it. It is the slow rise of prices that follows when money loses its trustworthiness, and it has haunted nearly every society that has tampered with its currency since. The coin had been a promise, and the promise was being quietly broken. By the later years of the empire, the debasement had grown severe, and prices in some places spiraled upward in ways that alarmed even the rulers. One emperor tried to halt the chaos by decreeing the prices that merchants were allowed to charge. But you cannot command trust by law, and the effort largely failed. There is a quiet lesson hidden in all of this, one that money would teach again and again across the centuries. The value of a currency rests not only on the metal within it, but on the faith that people place in it. Shave away that faith, even slowly, and the whole delicate structure begins to tremble. Rome's coins had lost their inner truth. Yet not far away, and not long after, another empire would show the world the opposite path, holding its gold steady for an astonishing span of time. As the western half of the Roman world weakened, its eastern half endured, centered on the great city of Constantinople. We often call this surviving realm the Byzantine Empire, though its people simply thought of themselves as Romans. And at the heart of its strength lay a single, remarkable coin. It was a gold coin called the solidus, first established under the Emperor Constantine. Where the old silver currency had been hollowed out by debasement, the solidus was held to a strict standard of weight and purity. Its makers resisted the ancient temptation to shave it, and that discipline became a quiet form of power. For something close to 700 years, the gold solidus kept its value with extraordinary steadiness. Generation after generation, merchants across the known world could accept it with confidence, knowing that its gold content would not betray them. Few currencies in all of history have remained trustworthy for so long. Because of this reliability, the solidus traveled far beyond the empire that minted it. Traders in distant lands who cared nothing for Byzantine politics still prized the coin for its dependable gold. It became a kind of common money of the wider world, accepted from the markets of Europe to the ports of the East. In this way, the solidus did for its age something like what a leading currency does in our own time. It served as a shared standard, a trusted measure against which other things could be valued. To hold a solidus was to hold a piece of stability in an unstable world. There is a lesson here as deep as the one Rome's decline had taught, but pointing in the opposite direction. Rome had shown how quickly trust could be squandered. Byzantium showed how patiently it could be built, and how much strength flowed to those who guarded the integrity of their money. The discipline was not merely financial. It was a statement about the empire itself, a sign that its word could be relied upon, that its promises held their weight. A stable coin whispered across borders and languages that here was a power that did not cheat those who trusted it. Of course, no empire lasts forever, and even Byzantium eventually faltered. In its later centuries, under mounting pressure, the once pure solidus too began to slip, its gold diluted as troubles mounted. The long age of the trustworthy coin slowly drew toward its close. Yet for as long as it held, the golden solidus stood as proof of a principle. Sound money is not only a convenience for trade, it is a foundation, quiet and largely invisible, upon which the confidence of a whole civilization can rest. While these empires rose and faded around the Mediterranean, far to the south another story of gold was unfolding, in lands where the metal flowed so freely that a single journey would astonish the world. Far to the south of the Mediterranean, beyond the vast golden sea of the Sahara, lay lands rich in the metal the wider world craved. The region of West Africa held deposits of gold so plentiful that, for centuries, much of the gold flowing into Europe and the Middle East had its origin there. From these lands, the metal began long journeys north. The journeys crossed the desert itself. Great caravans of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, carried gold northward and brought salt, cloth, and other goods south in return. This trans-Saharan trade wove together distant peoples, and it made the kingdoms that controlled it immensely wealthy. Among the greatest of these was the Empire of Mali. Sitting astride the gold and salt routes, Mali grew rich and powerful, its cities becoming centers of trade and learning. And its most renowned ruler was a man whose name still echoes in the history of wealth, Mansa Musa. If these quiet journeys help you drift toward rest, remember that you can follow SleepWise and share it with a friend who might like to learn something gentle in the dark. Now let us return to the long road across the sands. Mansa Musa ruled in the early part of the 14th century, and by many accounts he commanded resources almost beyond reckoning. He is often described as among the wealthiest figures in all of history, though such comparisons across the centuries are difficult and uncertain. What is clear is that the gold of Mali gave him extraordinary means. In a famous episode, Mansa Musa made a great pilgrimage across the desert toward the holy city of Mecca. His procession was vast, and he carried with him an enormous quantity of gold, distributing it generously along the way as he passed through distant cities. So much gold did he give and spend, it is said, that in some of the places he visited, the value of gold itself dipped for a time. By flooding those markets with the metal, he briefly made it less scarce, and so less dear. It was an early, vivid illustration of a deep truth about money. That truth is simple, but easily forgotten. The worth of gold, like the worth of any money, depends in part on its scarcity. Pour enough of it into a market, and even gold can lose a little of its luster, its price softening, under the sheer weight of supply. Mansa Musa was neither a hero of economics nor a villain of it. He was a ruler of immense wealth, moving through a world that had never seen such a display, and the ripples he left behind taught an unintended lesson. Abundance and value pull against one another, even for the most precious of metals. The gold of Africa would keep flowing north for generations. But across the ocean, unknown to all of them, lay a hoard so vast that its discovery would shake the value of money across an entire continent. When ships from Europe reached the Americas, they found two continents rich in precious metals. In the lands that would later be called Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. There lay vast deposits of silver and gold, far greater than anything the Old World had known. What followed would change the money of Europe profoundly. The conquest that opened these lands was often brutal, and the human cost was immense. Indigenous peoples suffered terribly under the seizure of their lands and the harsh labor of the mines. It is important not to gild that history, for the gleam of the metal was bought with a great deal of sorrow. One mountain in particular became legendary. At a place called Potosi, high in the Andes, a peak was found to be almost unimaginably rich in silver. From its depths poured a river of metal that flowed across the ocean and into the treasuries and markets of Europe for generations. At first, this seemed like boundless fortune. Spain, which controlled much of this wealth, grew dazzling and powerful, its coffers swollen with American silver and gold. To rulers and merchants alike, an endless supply of precious metal must have looked like an endless supply of wealth itself. But money does not quite work that way, and the old lesson returned in a new and larger form. As more and more silver and gold flooded into Europe, the metals slowly became less scarce, and as they grew more common, their power to purchase goods began gradually to fade. Prices across Europe rose over the decades, climbing in a long, slow swell that historians later called the price revolution. The same coin bought less than it once had, not because anyone had shaved it, but because there was simply so much more of it in circulation. Abundance had diluted worth, exactly as it had in the markets Mansa Musa once passed through. This was inflation again, but arriving by a different road. Rome had created it by weakening its coins from within. Now Europe met it by flooding itself with real, pure metal from across the sea. The result, strangely, was much the same: money that bought less and prices that climbed. There was a deep irony in all of it. The very abundance that made Spain seem rich also quietly undermined the value of the wealth it gathered. A treasure that grows without limit slowly teaches its owners that limitless treasure is a kind of contradiction. And so the world learned on a grand scale that gold and silver were not magical guarantees of prosperity. Their worth still depended on that delicate balance between desire and scarcity. Even mountains of metal obeyed the quiet rules that governed all money. As Europe absorbed this flood, another change was stirring, smaller and far less dramatic, in the back rooms of those who kept other people's gold. It would prove more revolutionary than any treasure fleet. The change began with a simple problem of safekeeping. Gold was precious and heavy, and a merchant with a great deal of it faced a constant worry: where to store it safely, out of reach of thieves. The natural answer was to entrust it to someone who already kept a strong vault. In the cities of Europe, the goldsmiths fit that role well. They worked with precious metal every day, and so they owned sturdy strong rooms to guard their stock. Gradually, people began to leave their own gold with these goldsmiths for safekeeping, and in return, they received a written receipt. That receipt was a quiet revolution waiting to unfold. It was a piece of paper promising that a certain amount of gold sat waiting in the goldsmith's vault to be reclaimed by whoever held the note. At first, it was simply a record, a way to prove what you had stored. But then something clever and far-reaching happened. People realized that rather than fetching their gold to make a payment, they could simply hand over the receipt itself. The new holder could trust that the gold was there to be collected, and so the paper began to pass from person to person in place of the metal. In this moment, paper money was quietly born. The receipt had become a thing of value in its own right, accepted in trade not because it was precious, but because it stood for something precious held safely elsewhere. A promise on paper had begun to do the work of gold. The goldsmiths soon noticed something else, something that would shape banking forever after. On any given day, only a few people came to reclaim their actual gold. Most of the metal simply sat in the vault, while the paper receipts circulated busily in the world outside. This gave the goldsmiths a tempting idea. If most of the gold stayed put, they could lend out receipts for more gold than they truly held at any one moment, trusting that not everyone would demand their metal at once. So they began to issue notes beyond the gold in their care, and to charge interest on what they lent. This was the seed of modern banking, and of a practice in which the notes in circulation come to exceed the actual metal behind them. It made lending and growth possible on a new scale. But it also carried a hidden fragility, for it relied entirely on confidence not breaking all at once. If too many people came at the same moment demanding their gold together, the vault could not satisfy them all. The promise would outrun the metal, and the trust that held it all together could collapse in a single anxious afternoon. This delicate balance between trust and reserve would underlie the world of money from that day forward. Paper now stood beside gold, lighter and more nimble, yet still leaning on the metal for its meaning. And nations, watching this quiet invention, would soon reach for it on a far grander scale. As paper money spread, nations began to organize their currencies with new care, and one country in particular would shape the future of gold. That country was Britain, and the story passes surprisingly through one of the greatest minds in the history of science. Isaac Newton is remembered above all for his work on gravity, motion, and light. But in the later part of his life, he took up a very different post. In the closing years of the 1600s, he became an official of the Royal Mint, the place where the nation's coins were made, and he threw himself into the work with great seriousness. Newton pursued his duties with rigor. He hunted counterfeiters who clipped and forged the king's coins, tracking some of them through the taverns and back streets of the city. The man who had measured the heavens now measured the metal in a nation's currency, and he did so with the same exacting care. In the early 1700s, Newton set an official value for gold in relation to silver. The exact details were technical, but the effect was lasting. The way he fixed that ratio gently nudged Britain away from silver and toward gold as the true anchor of its money. Over the following years, this drift hardened into a system. Britain came to define its currency in terms of a fixed quantity of gold, so that the pound itself was, in effect, a certain weight of the metal. Paper notes could be brought to the bank and exchanged for that gold on demand. This arrangement is what we call a gold standard. Under it, the money people carried was tied firmly to gold, and the promise of that exchange gave the currency its backbone. A banknote was, in a sense, a portable claim upon real metal resting in a vault. The Bank of England stood at the center of this structure, holding reserves of gold and issuing notes that the public learned to trust. The trust was crucial, the very heart of the whole arrangement. People accepted paper not because the paper itself was precious, but because they believed it could always become gold again. There was a deep reassurance in this. It meant that money was not merely a promise floating free, but a promise tethered to something solid and scarce. A government could not simply print endless notes without the gold to honor them, or so the theory went, and that limit gave people a quiet sense of safety. In time, Britain's example would prove enormously influential. As its trade and empire spread across the globe, so too did the idea of anchoring money to gold. What began with a brilliant scientist adjusting a ratio at the mint would grow into a system that bound much of the world together, currency by currency, nation by nation. The age of the gold standard was dawning, and for a time it would knit the nations of the earth into a single, glittering web of trust. By the later part of the 19th century, the gold standard had spread across much of the world. One nation after another tied its currency to gold, defining its money as a fixed weight of the metal. For the first time, a great many countries shared a single, common anchor for their wealth. The effect on trade was remarkable. If the pound was a certain amount of gold and another currency was also a certain amount of gold, then the rate between them was fixed and known. Merchants could trade across borders without fearing that money would shift wildly beneath their feet. This brought a kind of stability that earlier ages had rarely enjoyed. A trader in one country could sign a contract with a partner in another, confident that the value of payment would hold steady across the months it took for goods to travel. Gold, resting quietly in vaults, became the silent guarantor of bargains made across oceans. It was, in many ways, an age of confidence. Capital flowed between nations with unusual freedom, and the great web of international trade grew dense and intricate. Some look back on this era as a first great age of global commerce, bound together by the shared discipline of the metal, when goods and money crossed borders as never before. There was beauty in the design. No single government could inflate its money away on a whim, because each currency was chained to gold. The standard imposed an honesty of sorts, a limit that no ruler could easily cross without consequence. But the same chains that brought stability could also bind too tightly. Because money was tied to gold, a nation could not simply create more of it when hard times came. In a downturn, When people most needed relief, the gold standard often demanded restraint instead. This was the hidden cost of the system. Its great virtue, that money could not be conjured from nothing, was also its great rigidity. When economies slumped, the discipline of gold could deepen the pain, forcing wages and prices down rather than allowing easier money to soften the blow. The metal was loyal to its own logic, not to human suffering. So the gold standard was both a marvel and a cage. It offered trust, stability, and a brake on reckless governments. Yet it also took away a nation's freedom to respond, in a crisis, with the flexibility that desperate times sometimes require. For decades, the marvel outweighed the cage, and the system seemed almost a permanent feature of civilization. The world had grown used to gold as the quiet foundation beneath its money, steady and unquestioned, a fact of life, as reliable as the turning of the seasons. Few imagined how quickly that foundation could be shaken. Then came a catastrophe vast enough to break the chain. When the nations of the world turned to war, the discipline of gold would be among the first things they set aside. Before we follow gold into the storms of the 20th century, let us pause on one of its most human chapters, the Great Rushes, when the discovery of the metal sent waves of people surging across the earth in search of fortune. Few things reveal the pull of gold so vividly. It often began with a single glint in a stream. In the middle of the 19th century, gold was found in the rivers of California, in the far west of North America. Word spread with astonishing speed, and within a short time, a vast tide of hopeful seekers was pouring toward the gold fields. They came by the tens of thousands from across the continent and from distant lands beyond the sea. They left farms, shops, and families behind, drawn by the dream of riches lying in the gravel of a riverbed. Whole towns sprang up almost overnight, raw and restless, built on hope and hard labor, with their saloons and stores rising from bare ground. The reality was harsher than the dream. For every fortune found, countless seekers met only exhaustion, disappointment, and hardship. Panning for gold was grueling work, and the easy surface deposits were quickly stripped away, leaving most to toil for little or nothing. Yet the rushes transformed the lands they touched. They accelerated the settlement of vast regions, reshaped landscapes, and sometimes displaced the peoples who had lived there long before. The hunger for gold could build cities and break communities in nearly the same breath. Other rushes followed across the decades and around the world. There were great surges toward the gold fields of Australia, and later toward the frozen rivers of the Klondike, in the cold northwest of the Americas. Each one drew its own crowds of dreamers into harsh and distant country, willing to endure almost anything for a chance at the gleam. There is something revealing in this recurring fever. Gold, which has no taste and grows no food, could still move human beings to cross oceans and climb mountains in its pursuit. The same qualities that made it good money, its rarity and its gleam, also made it an object of almost helpless longing. a promise of escape from ordinary life. The rushes were not really about coins or commerce. They were about the dream of sudden transformation, the hope that a single lucky strike might change a life forever. In that hope lay both the magic and the cruelty of gold's hold on the imagination. And when the gravel was emptied and the easy gold was gone, most of the seekers drifted away, leaving quiet ghost towns behind to weather and decay. The fever passed, but the longing it revealed never fully faded from the human heart. Soon, though, the world would have far graver concerns than panning for gold. The 20th century was about to test the metal and the money built upon it as never before. When the Great War engulfed the nations of the world in the early 20th century, it brought a kind of spending the gold standard had never been built to bear. Modern war was ruinously expensive, devouring resources, weapons, and lives on a scale never seen before. And to pay for it, governments needed far more money than their gold could honestly support. Here, the old discipline became an obstacle. Under a strict gold standard, a nation could only issue money in proportion to the gold it held. But a country at war for its very survival was in no mood to be restrained by the metal in its vaults. So, one by one, the warring nations quietly loosened the chain. They suspended the promise to exchange their paper money for gold on demand, freeing themselves to print the currency they needed. The tether between money and metal, once thought almost sacred, was set aside in the name of necessity, and few dared object while the fighting raged. This was a momentous step, though it was taken under the pressure of emergency. For the first time in living memory, the money in many people's hands was no longer reliably backed by gold. It had become, in large part, a promise resting on the authority of the state alone. With the break released, governments printed freely to fund the fighting. The quantity of money swelled, and as it did, the familiar consequence followed. Prices rose, and the value of each unit of currency began to slip, in some places gently, and in others severely, eating quietly into the savings of ordinary people. In a few unfortunate nations, the loss of discipline went much further. In the years after the war, certain countries printed money so recklessly that their currencies collapsed almost entirely. In episodes of runaway inflation that became infamous, money could be carried in wheelbarrows and still buy almost nothing. These extreme cases were terrifying warnings. They showed what could happen when money was cut completely loose from any anchor and printed without limit. The very freedom that had helped finance the war could, if abused, destroy a currency altogether, wiping out savings and trust in a matter of months. Yet, for all the danger, the war had revealed something important and lasting. When survival truly demanded it, nations would not let gold stand in their way. The metal's hold on money, once thought unbreakable, had proven to be a choice rather than a law of nature. After the guns fell silent, many longed to return to the old certainties, to rebuild the steady world the gold standard had once provided. They wished to mend the broken chain and restore money to its golden anchor, as though the war had been a brief storm that could simply be forgotten. But the world had changed, and the path back to gold would prove far more treacherous than anyone hoping for it could yet foresee. In the years after the war, several nations tried to return to the gold standard, hoping to recover the stability they had lost. It seemed a natural wish, a longing to restore the trusted order of an earlier age. But the attempt would prove fragile, and for some, deeply damaging. Britain offered a striking example. In the middle of the 1920s, it chose to return to gold at the old pre-war value of its currency, the rate that had held before the fighting began. The decision was made partly out of pride and a desire to reclaim past prestige. The trouble was that the world had changed, and that old value no longer fit the new reality. Pinning the currency so high made British goods expensive to foreign buyers, and the economy strained under the effort. Industry suffered, and unemployment lingered as the country bent itself to honor a number from a vanished world. Then came a far greater shock. As the 1920s closed, a vast economic collapse spread across much of the world. The calamity later remembered as the Great Depression. Banks failed, trade shrank, and millions lost their work and their savings in a wave of hardship. In this crisis, the gold standard revealed its harshest face. Because currencies were tied to gold, governments struggling against the slump found their hands bound, unable to ease conditions by expanding the money supply. The very discipline that had seemed a virtue now deepened the suffering, holding money tight precisely when people most needed it. Loosened. Worse still, the system spread the pain from country to country. Because the world's money was linked through gold, troubles in one nation could pass quickly to others, like a chill moving through a single connected body. The standard that had bound the world together in good times now bound it together in misery. Gradually, painfully, nations began to abandon gold once more. One by one, they cut their currencies loose from the metal, freeing themselves to fight the depression with easier money. And often, those who left gold soonest were the ones who began to recover first, a pattern that did not go unnoticed by those still clinging on. This was a hard and clarifying lesson. The gold standard, for all its beauty, could become a trap in times of crisis, a rigid frame that snapped under pressure rather than bending. The dream of a money anchored forever to metal was quietly cracking. By the time the world emerged from the Depression and stumbled toward another great war, the old gold standard lay largely in ruins. Few believed it could simply be rebuilt as it had been before, in the same rigid form that had failed so badly. And yet, gold was not finished. After the next catastrophe, the nations would gather to give the metal one last great roll at the center of the world's money. As the Second Great War drew toward its close, the nations of the world looked ahead with weary eyes. They had seen what disorderly money could do, the inflations and collapses and trade wars that had darkened the years between the conflicts. This time, they resolved to build something steadier from the wreckage. So, near the end of the fighting, Delegates from many countries gathered at a quiet resort in the hills of New Hampshire, a place called Bretton Woods. There, over careful negotiation, they designed a new framework for the money of the post-war world. Gold would have a central place in it, though in a subtler form than before. At the heart of the new system stood the United States. Its economy had emerged from the war immensely strong, and it held a vast share of the world's gold within its vaults. Because of this, the American dollar was chosen to play a special and powerful role. The arrangement worked in two linked steps. The United States promised to tie its dollar to gold, exchanging the metal for dollars at a fixed price for foreign governments who asked. Other nations, in turn, tied their own currencies not directly to gold, but to the dependable American dollar. In this way, the dollar became, in effect, as good as gold. It sat between the metal and the world's other currencies, a trusted bridge linking them all. Nations could hold dollars in their reserves, confident that those dollars could be turned into gold if ever they wished. This clever design gave the world much of the stability of a gold standard, while allowing a little more flexibility than the old rigid system. New institutions were created to help keep it running and to assist countries that fell into difficulty. For a time, it worked remarkably well. The decades that followed saw a great rebuilding and a long stretch of growth across much of the world. Trade flourished once more, currencies held steady against one another, and the dollar reigned as the trusted center of it all. Gold still anchored the system, but now it did so quietly, one step removed, resting behind the dollar. Yet within this elegant arrangement lay a hidden strain, the same kind of strain the goldsmiths had once discovered in their vaults. The promise to exchange dollars for gold rested on there being enough gold to honor it. And as the years passed, more and more dollars flowed out into the world. Slowly, the dollars held abroad began to outgrow the gold sitting in American vaults. The promise was quietly stretching thinner, just as the goldsmith's notes once had. A gap was opening between what had been pledged and what could truly be delivered. It could not stretch forever. One day, the world would test that promise, and the last great link between gold and money would face its final reckoning. As the 1960s wore on, the strain at the heart of the system grew harder to ignore. The United States had sent great quantities of dollars out into the world, through trade, through spending abroad, through the costs of its commitments. Far more dollars now existed than the gold held to back them. Foreign governments began to notice. Some grew uneasy holding dollars whose promise of gold seemed less and less certain. A few started to ask for the metal itself, presenting their dollars and requesting gold in return, drawing slowly on the American reserves, coin by coin and bar by bar. This was the goldsmith's old fear made real on a global scale. If enough nations came demanding gold at once, the vaults could not possibly satisfy them all. The promise that underpinned the whole system was being quietly called in, and it could not be fully honored. Pressure mounted year by year. The amount of gold leaving the vaults became a genuine worry, and the gap between dollars and metal kept widening with time. The architects of the system faced a hard choice between defending the old promise and protecting the nation's remaining gold, and the two goals could no longer both be met. Then, in the summer of 1971, the decision came. The United States announced that it would no longer exchange dollars for gold, suspending the promise that had anchored the system. In the language of the time, the gold window was closed. It was a quiet announcement with enormous consequences. With that single act, the last formal link between the world's money and gold was severed. The dollar, and through it, nearly all the world's currencies, now floated free of the metal entirely. For the first time in the long history we have followed, money across the world rested on no gold at all. The coins and notes in people's hands were no longer claims on metal in a vault. They were backed instead by something far less tangible: trust in governments and the shared agreement among people to keep using them as money. This was a profound turning point, though many who lived through it scarcely felt the ground shift beneath them. Life went on, prices were paid, wages earned, and money kept doing its quiet work. The great change was almost invisible, hidden inside the ordinary act of buying and selling, felt by almost no one in the moment it occurred. And yet, something ancient had ended. The thread that had run from the first gold coins of Lydia, through Rome and Byzantium, through the goldsmiths and the gold standard, had finally been cut after thousands of years. Money had let go of gold's hand and stepped out, for the first time, entirely on its own. What kind of money was this that stood on trust alone? To understand the world we live in now, we must look closely at the strange and powerful thing that money became. There is something in gold that reason alone cannot quite explain. For thousands of years, across every upheaval we have followed tonight, the metal has held its grip on human desire. Empires rose and fell. Money changed its forms again and again, yet the longing for gold endured beneath it all. Part of this is practical, rooted in the very qualities we spoke of at the start of our journey. Gold does not rust or rot or fade with the passing years. It cannot be created by decree, and its supply grows only slowly, no matter how badly anyone might wish for more. In a world of promises that can break, it offers something that simply persists. This is why, in uncertain times, people still turn to gold. When currencies wobble, when inflation gnaws at savings, when fear spreads through markets, many seek shelter in the old metal. They buy it not for its beauty alone, but as a refuge, a store of worth they hope will outlast the storm. In this role, gold has become a kind of insurance against disorder. It pays no interest and produces nothing, yet its very stillness is the point. When everything else feels precarious, there is comfort in holding something that has been valued since before history was written, something no crisis has ever managed to render worthless. But the pull of gold runs deeper than cold calculation. There is a psychology to it, woven through with feeling and symbol. Its warm light has always seemed to promise permanence, an escape from the decay that claims nearly everything else we know. We crown the victorious with gold and exchange it in marriage as a token of lasting devotion. We speak of a golden age, a golden rule, a heart of gold. The metal has soaked up our deepest associations with what is precious, enduring, and pure, far beyond any role it ever played in trade. In our own time, this ancient longing has even taken new forms. Some have sought to create a kind of digital scarcity, a money limited in supply and beyond the reach of any government, and they have often reached for gold as their guiding metaphor. The dream of incorruptible value, it seems, never truly fades. It only finds new vessels to carry it forward. Perhaps that is the truest thing about gold. It is not merely a metal nor merely money, but a vessel for a very human hope. The hope that amid all the change and loss of life, something might remain steady, bright, and untarnished, outlasting even those who treasure it. That hope is why gold still rests in vaults, still glints on fingers, still draws the eye in the dark. It answers a longing far older than any coin, a wish for permanence in a world that grants so little of it. And so, having followed gold across the whole of human history, we come at last to where it rests today, and to the quiet truth that has been waiting beneath this entire story. Consider for a moment the strange journey of a single piece of gold today. It is torn from deep within the earth in mines that reach far down into the dark. It is crushed, washed, and refined through great labor, purified into gleaming bars, and then, very often, much of it is carried into a vault and buried once more. We dig gold out of the ground in one place, only to lock it away underground in another. Seen plainly, there is something almost comic in this, a vast and costly effort to move the metal from one darkness into another. Yet within that strange ritual lies the deepest truth of our whole story. The value of gold was never really in the metal itself, in its weight or its softness or its gleam. It lived all along in the agreement among human beings that this substance would stand for worth. That is the quiet revelation beneath the entire history of money. From the first stamped coins of Lydia to the paper in our pockets today, money has always been a story we tell together, a shared belief that turns objects and symbols into value. Gold simply told that story longer and more beautifully than anything else ever has. When we let go of gold at last, we did not lose that magic. We only saw it more clearly than before. Money had always been built of trust, and gold had merely been trust given a shining, solid form, easy to hold in the hand and hard to doubt with the eye. There is something gently humbling in this. The great vaults, the empires, the rushes and standards and treaties, all of it rested upon a kind of collective imagination. We agreed, and the agreement became real. as solid in its effects as the heavy metal that once embodied it, shaping the lives of billions who never paused to question it. And perhaps that is not a thing to mourn, but to wonder at quietly. It means that value is, at its very heart, a human creation, woven from trust and memory and shared belief across the generations. We are the ones who make gold precious, who breathe worth into metal and paper alike, and who could, if we chose, believe in something else entirely. So tonight, as the world grows quiet, you might picture all that gold resting in its vaults, gleaming softly in the dark, meaning everything and doing nothing at all. It waits, patient and bright, holding the value we've lent it across the long centuries, asking nothing in return but our continued belief. The mines grow still, the vaults are sealed, the markets fall silent for the night, and the long story of gold rests with them, as old as civilization and quiet as a held breath. Let the metal keep its gleam in the darkness. Let value remain the gentle agreement it has always been. And let yourself drift now, far from coins and markets, into the soft and weightless country of sleep. The world slows, and so do we.